Hello and welcome to the Craft Beer Corner. For today's beer review, we've got another installment in my local, to me, Florida craft brewer series where I spotlight different craft brewers from my home state of Florida. Today we are returning yet again to one of my hometown brewers, Cigar City Brewing, certainly one of the most well-known out of the state of Florida, hands down the most well-known out of Tampa where I live. Nonetheless, we are doing a couple of different IPAs by Cigar City today. So we are going to be starting with Tocobaga. This is a red IPA, clocks in at 7.2% ABV, and it's 65 IBUs. They do make a note of them on the can. Again, as you know, I say IBUs are really just the scientific basis behind what it is, but bitterness perception is a completely separate animal. So, you know, you can think of it as a gauge, but it's not really indicative of how you personally will necessarily perceive bitterness. It's different for everybody, so take it with a grain of salt. This one is brewed specifically and dry hopped with Citra hops. And then number two, we are moving on to Alai. This is just a standard IPA. This one clocks in at 7.5% ABV. Just as with the Tocobaga, this is also marked as 65 IBUs. Now, I do know that this beer is brewed with a blend of 6 different hops, though I don't know what they have in the hop bill. I wasn't able to locate that information anywhere. I don't know if they're keeping it a trade secret, but nonetheless, it's got 6 different hop varieties in there. So we're going to go ahead and jump in and get started with the first beer. This is Tocobaga, the red IPA, 7.2% ABV, brewed with Citra hops in Cigar City, my hometown brewer based in Tampa, Florida. Okay, so jumping into our first beer of today's Cigar City IPA review. This is another installment in my local Florida craft brewer series, where I am highlighting and spotlighting various offerings from some of the most well-known craft brewers in Florida. Florida is a big craft brewer hotbed. You know, there's a lot of different pockets around the country. Oregon certainly has the most craft brewers anywhere. Even it's a reasonably populous state, but it's not in the top for sure. California obviously has a ton. Texas has a ton. Florida has a ton. North Carolina really tends to be states with higher populations, and Florida's top 5, of course. I think it's top 3 or 4. But nonetheless, we're going to jump right in with this one. This is the red IPA, 7.2% ABV, 65 IBUs, and it's brewed with Citra and also dry hopped with Citra. I know it's impossible to tell any of the art on the can, you know, with the camera here, but it's got kind of a Native American scene with some huts, and I don't know, maybe it's Mayan. I don't know. It's tough to say. It looks like huts. I'm guessing Native American. I couldn't tell you. I haven't researched the art on their can, but nonetheless, let's get this one cracked. All right. And I have had many Cigar City beers, but this is one that will be new to me. So I'm very excited about this as well. I have never had Tocobaga. Might have gone just a bit too intense on the initial pour into this glass here, because that is just an insane head right there. That is just insane. While I'm letting that settle a bit before I top it off, visually, yeah, it's got an amberish hue to it. It's more of a caramelly with a slight hint of red, so I guess I could see where they're going here with a red IPA. It doesn't look that dissimilar to a standard red ale or lager, but okay. I'd call it more caramel. The head, obviously you can see, formed quite well. In fact, I might even say too well. So I'm indeed, before I even jump in for a sniff, I'm going to break some of this down. That's just a little much here. Give this a chance to settle. But what I can say is it definitely is a very thick, creamy, foamy head. It didn't have a problem creating a head. I imagine it'll retain pretty well too. Ooh, I've got a little preview there from the foam. Try not to think on it too much. There's not that much you can glean from foam. You really need a proper sip that you can swish around the palate. But nonetheless, let's jump in for aroma here. Okay, yep, this is really what I expected it to smell like. You get very big, bold, classic Citra aromas. It does smell very citrusy. It's probably one of the reasons they named it Citra. It's very Citra forward in the aroma. Also imparts some of that in the flavor as well, but it's got an interesting mix of flavor traits. You can get kind of pine resinous, citrus, and very classic kind of earthy, but big, bold. It's a high alpha acid hop variety. Gosh, smells great. In tandem with the Citra hops, classic aromas, you can really smell this malt bill. And it does indeed smell very caramelly, so very much matching the overall appearance of the beer. Luckily, this head has settled itself down a bit, so I'm going to try to gently, down the side of the glass here, just get this one topped off. All right. And you know, I broke down the head about as well as I could. It's still a bit higher than I would normally dive into beer. It's looking a lot more akin to a stout head than an IPA, but I'm going to go ahead and jump in for a sip, so let's do it. One more final sip. God, it smells great. Let's jump in and do it. Oh, that's a very nice IPA. Very hop forward. I would believe 65 IPUs. It's got a very bitter forward nature to it. The thing about this beer is, with the caramelly malts, it puts me in mind of a lot of characteristics and traits that come through in Imperials. At 7.2, that's kind of really getting to the high end of average for an IPA. You know, it's not Imperial territory, but it's getting on up there. So it's got a fair bit of fermentables in it anyway. And then just the style itself is naturally going to be brewed with more caramelly malts. And it's a mix of different malts, but caramel are part of the bill. Caramel malts are a very flavor forward and aroma forward malt to use in a beer. And that caramelly flavor does often come through and overpower hops, particularly in IPAs, I find. It balances well in other beer styles, but in IPAs, caramel malts, you got to be careful you don't use too many in your malt bill, because you can very quickly overpower particularly the flavor. You can do it with aroma as well, but citrus is a nice big pungent hop, but with the flavor it's easy to do. This is pretty well balanced. I do think that some of the caramel takes some of the bitter edge out of this, even though you can tell it's Citra hop forward, and definitely the hop pungency does come through and the bitterness does come through, but I don't think that the perceived bitterness actually comes through as prevalently as it otherwise would if there weren't as much reliance on the caramel malts. I'm assuming it's caramel malts. That's very much what it tastes and looks like to me. It could be some other very closely related derivative thereof, but you know, caramel malts are all falling in a range of SRM or in various numbers on the Lovabond. It's got to do with the depth of the roasting. That's what categorizes all these white chocolate malts, are the deep, almost pitch black, and look like coffee beans, a very deeply roasted coffee bean. This is in the middle, and visually it's one of the reasons they call it caramel malts, and also it imparts those same aroma and flavors. But it's a very good beer. I'm going to jump in for body and mouthfeel, explore these flavors developing again. Body is not as robust as you'd expect for 7.2%. I would say it's medium. I expected medium heavy. It's not that heavy. Not a knock per se, but I do like a little more robust body to a beer, especially in higher ABV range. The mouthfeel is nice. I wouldn't say it's viscous, and I wouldn't say it's overtly creamy. It feels very much like a classic IPA mouthfeel. It does cream up if you really start to agitate it around the palate to let all the flavors linger around so you can really think about and enjoy each sip. But other than that, it's a pretty standard mouthfeel. I just also at 7.2% would expect more viscosity than it brings to the table. Now, flavor development. When you first get it in your mouth, you get really an even mix of that caramelly malt flavor and the citra hop flavor that comes through. So it does impart slight citrus flavors. It's much more so on the aroma side than the flavor end, but some of that does come through. And it's got a little mix of slightly floral and a lot of earthy. Many hops have that classic earthy, but Citra higher alpha acid content. It's a much more intense bitter. So it's got layers of flavor. And they all pair very well with a red IPA malt bill. Certainly they do play in with those caramelly flavors. Again, it does mute the bitters a little bit, but not that much. They clearly used a heavier hand with the hops here so that you can still get a ton of hop aroma, a ton of hop flavor, and still get a good bunch of bitters. But the perceived bitterness is certainly not as bitter as in beers that don't have a more caramelly, malt bill like this one does. It's nice. Balance-wise, I would say this is very well balanced. They let the hop shine through, even though with the malt base based on the style of brewing, a red IPA, it's going to be fighting a little bit for, flavor and aroma. It's still hopped enough that the hops come through as the dominant factor here. They're not really getting drowned out by the malt bill. You can taste them and smell them both independently and quite clearly. But it's not drowned out. I would say overall, I do think it's very well balanced. The finish is not ridiculously long. It's another aspect, I don't know, this seems to happen with the more caramelly malt backbone IPAs that I've had, certainly most Imperials. The finish doesn't go as long, the bitters aren't as prevalent. I don't know, there's something about that caramel flavor that just kind of overrides the bitter sensation. And it's normally these alpha acids in tandem with creaminess or viscosity with the mouthfeel that help IPA hop flavors, and certainly the bitters linger around the palate. And this one's got a decently long finish, but it's not top tier. I think some of that caramel malt edge is just kind of drowning out that residual. I mean, I still get a little bit of the bitters in the back, and really on the very end of the finish, that slightly bit that's left lingering, that's where the bulk of those kind of piney and resinous qualities from the citrus hop really pop into play. Not so much in terms of flavor before that. They're not as intense. It's much more earthy and citrus and floral. But at the end, it's a little resinous. It's nice. It's a good beer. I do enjoy it. I'm going to take my time, sip on this, think critically about this one, come up with my scores. And when we come back, we'll get to beer number 2. This is the Alai Standard IPA, 7.5% ABV. That one's brewed with 6 hops, though I don't know the varieties. And that one, just as with the Tocobaga, they mark as 65 IBUs. So that one's coming up next. Okay, moving on to our second beer of today's Cigar City Brewing IPA review, part of my Florida Local Craft Brewer series. This is Alai IPA. It's 7.5% ABV. Same IBUs as the first, 65. It's a blend of 6 different hops, though I don't know what hops they used in this. On the can, there are indeed Alai players. And this is another fun bit of Tampa trivia. Tampa was actually at one point the Alai capital of the world. There was more Alai being played here than anywhere else. If you don't know about it, it's a very interesting sport. It's played indoors on what looks almost like an oversized racquetball court, closed inside, same thing, ceiling, walls, floor. But they wear these interesting, almost looks like a wicker knitted mitt on their hands, and they're flinging around this really tiny ball, and it's the fastest sport in the world that we're not talking motorsports. The balls can travel well over 180 miles an hour. It's insane. It's insanely dangerous. I mean, I can't even imagine what would happen if you got hit by that ball. But nonetheless, just another bit of trivia. It's another nod to some of Tampa's heritage here, but let's get this one cracked. All right. And I caught it before it made a mess all over my table. Sometimes I have the worst luck with beers being overly aggressive in their carbonation when they crack. I'm probably cracking them too briskly instead of gently venting it and letting the carbonation slowly It just encourages it to start bubbling out, and it wants to form a head even while it's in the can. But nonetheless, got it poured in the glass. Holding this up to the light, this is a little bit darker than your average standard IPA, but it's still within range of what I picture in my head when I think of an IPA. It's kind of a golden yellow color. I would say it is pretty well clear. It's a clear beer, though the depth of color makes it a little hard to see through. It's not a hazy. Formed a nice creamy head that I am not surprised. Most Cigar City beers that I pour at home do form a very thick, lush head. Let's jump in and give it a sniff. This is very hop dominant. You can smell a blend of all the hops. I know they use 6 varieties, and you can tell that they're all bringing something different to the table because you get all of the main classic common hop aromas, most of them anyway. You get a lot of pine, a lot of resin, you get a lot of earthy, you get a lot of floral, and you get a good bit of citrus. Really, the only thing I'm missing is the tropical fruit aroma that you get from many hops. That one's not present in here. Not really. The pine and the earthy and the slight bit of citrus and floral are kind of the dominant four, with pine being at the forefront, earthy behind that, then floral, then citrus. Kind of in that pecking order in terms of intensity of aroma. You can also really detect the malt bill in this. This is another one that smells a little caramelly, and certainly looking at the depth of color, it's probably got some caramel malt in here. I wouldn't be surprised by that, but it smells great. Let's go ahead and jump in. That head settled down enough. I'm going to jump in for first sip here. Mm. Mm. Oh, it's a very nice beer. It's a big beer. It's a big IPA right here. It's very hop forward. Very hop forward, very dominant in terms of bitters. Even though it looks like it might have a good bit of caramel malts in it, I could tell you whatever malt bill that they did use is in a ratio that it doesn't drown out the hop at all. This is very hop centric. This is a very hop dominant, hop forward IPA. This is not for casual IPA drinkers. This is one for true hop heads for sure. This is a very hop centric beer. Okay. Really, what's coming through is a massive amalgam of different hop characteristics in terms of flavor, just as with the aroma. And I'll talk about what lingers when I jump in to finally explore how the flavors develop and how it finishes it out. But first, let me jump in for body and mouthfeel. The body on this one, compared to the prior, feels medium heavy. It's not a lighter body. It's right where I'd expect for a 7.5% ABV IPA. The mouthfeel also has a heck of a lot more viscosity than the Tocobaga did. It's thick, it's viscous, it's sticky. It sticks around the palate and it's wet. The flavors, the way they develop essentially is you get a giant burst of all of the classic hop flavor character traits that come through. You're getting a mix of citrus and floral and earthy and resinous and piney all coming through. Same thing with the aroma though. I'm not getting any tropical fruit notes. So none of that in the aroma, none of it in the flavor, but all of the other major hop characteristics, they're really coming through and they're intense. This is a very pungent IPA. The other thing that I should mention about this is for an IPA, this is the kind of IPA that I deem to be exceptionally well balanced. It's a story about the hop, and none of them overpower the others. You get every bit that they threw in here, and you can pick them out individually, both in terms of aroma and in terms of what they're bringing to the table in the flavor profile. The malt bill is there for sure. You can taste it, but the malts are not drowning out the hops at all. The hop is the star of the show, as it should be in an IPA. And this is a big one. This is a very, very big one for hop enthusiasts, shall I say. I'm going to jump in one final sip for final thoughts here on the flavor development and finish. Mix of floral, actually a little bit of citrus. That's the burst up front, floral and citrus. Then it opens up into very strong pungent earthy and pine and resinous and tarry. And then that just overtakes everything else. It's earthy and pine resin tar. Those two kind of subcategories of hop flavors, and they just intensify and intensify. And then it starts a very slow descent. So the bell curve is kind of skewed. It makes a massive, very fast incline and peak, and then it kind of holds, and then it's a very slow, gradual tail off on the back end here. It does have a long finish. It's not top tier. It's not super, super long, but there's a lot of viscosity to this beer, and it's clear they used a lot of high alpha acid content hops, and they weren't shy about putting them in there and extracting them into the beer during the boil, because the bitters really do linger around the palate. It's certainly well above average. I wouldn't say top tier status, but it's not far off. Overall, this is an IPA for absolute hop lovers. If you're a fan of big, bold, pungent, hop forward, bitter forward IPA, you would absolutely love this beer. Pungent, all about the hop, and it's intense. It's intense hop aroma, intense hop flavor, and intense hop bitters that all come through in this beer. I've had this one many, many times, and it's always a treat to revisit. I'm going to take my time and sip on this, come up with my scores, and when we come back, we will get both beers ranked from top to bottom. Okay, now that we've gotten to enjoy both of these beers, we're going to get them ranked, starting with the Tocobaga. This is the red IPA of the bunch. 7.2% ABV on this one, 65 IBUs, brewed with Citra hops and also dry hopped with Citra hops. Again, Cigar City is based out of Tampa, Florida. Starting with the aroma. The aroma on this was nice. You could smell the hops and you could smell the malt bill, but it wasn't a super pronounced aroma. It was above average, but not top tier. It gets a 7. For the taste, very enjoyable beer. The kind of caramelly malt undertone, which really is kind of requisite to create a red IPA or really any red ale. It's got to have some of those darker, more caramelly to impart that hue. But in an IPA form, it does have a propensity to kind of cut and play over the hops. It did a little bit, not over the top, but it was enough to drown out the hop characteristic a little and some of the lingering bitters that would have otherwise been present. Still above average. I gave it an 8 out of 10 for the taste. Body on this one. I was actually very surprised. The body on this was much more subdued than I anticipated, given the ABV for sure. It wasn't flat, but at 7.2, that's a pretty good ABV. I expected it to have some substance, and it was really just kind of average. Low end, I gave it a 4. Mouthfeel. Mouthfeel on this was okay. Didn't really have much viscosity, so to speak. It had more or less a classic IPA mouthfeel, but the lack of viscosity in tandem with not really getting that much creamy, so rolling it around, it wasn't that much different than water or juice. It was still average. I gave it a high end for this. I gave it a 6. Finish on this one. Finish on this was pretty long. Certainly Citra is a high alpha acid content hop, so that definitely had an impact. The hop flavors didn't linger as long as I would have liked, nor did the bitters, but it was still certainly well above average. I think the malt bill kind of subdued it more. If this same beer were brewed with a slightly altered malt bill, I think it would be a bit more pronounced, but it was still very enjoyable. I gave it an 8 out of 10. Head and retention was fantastic on this beer. It poured just as thick and lush and creamy as you could hope for. It gets a perfect 10 out of 10. Appearance-wise, I thought it was very close to a classic red IPA or really any kind of red beer. It was a little darker than you typically see, but it was still in range. I only docked 1 point for its depth of dark versus more red hue. I gave it a 9. Balance on this. I thought it was a good beer, and I thought it was well balanced, but really the underlying issue I had with this one was the malt bill in tandem with the hop. The malt bill just... And it didn't do it to the same level that you've heard me talk about Imperials, but it did overpower the hop a bit just from that caramelly edge. That tends to happen in IPAs that have that in the malt base, particularly in larger quantities, which this appeared to. I would have balanced just more hops, really. Keep the malt bill to get the depth, the color that you want, and to get that backbone, but just put more hops, extract more alphas in there to help cut through the malt. Nonetheless, I still said it was above average. I gave it a 7. Feeling in the intangible, I enjoyed the beer. I don't often drink red IPAs. There's not really a ton out there in the market. But you know, it was enjoyable. It was certainly one of the more hop-forward red IPAs I've had. I can say that for sure. And you know, Citra hop is a really good choice. High alphas in there. Had some flavors that really paired well with the malt bill. I still would have just liked more hop presence, more hop pungency, but still above average. I gave it a 7. Finally, as an example of the style, again, I thought it was a very well done beer. I thought it was a good example of the style. I thought it was above average, but a couple minor nitpicks. More hops, more alpha acids extracted, helped balance out the malt a little more. And honestly, the body and the mouthfeel, I was really kind of surprised given the ABV and the beer style, but I still thought it was above average overall. I gave it a 7. So that brings the total score on Tocobaga Red IPA to a 73 out of 100. So certainly a good beer, certainly above average, just not in the top tier realm for me. Moving on to beer number 2, we've got Alai. This is a standard IPA, 7.5% ABV on this one. As with the first 65 IBUs, this is made with a blend of 6 different hops, though I couldn't find anywhere that lists the hop varieties. It is quite clear, though, upon first sniff and sip, that they are indeed high alpha acid content hops. No question about it. Starting with the aroma. The aroma on this one was nice. It actually wasn't as pronounced as I expected, given what the hop bill kind of gave me a clue before I even jumped in. But it was certainly above average. I think maybe the head was just so thick, kind of same thing with this one, that it had a hard time really coming out of the glass, but it was above average. I gave it an 8. Taste. Really enjoyed this beer. Really, really enjoyed this beer. It's very hop forward, it's very hop dominant, and it's very bitter forward. Given that they had so many hops in there and a standard IPA at 7.5, I don't think they missed the mark by much. But for me, I would have liked the hop flavor to be a little more forward, and I could have used even more bitters. Now I know 65 IPUs, so they're not going into stone ruination territory here, but in a beer that was just as promising as this, and don't get me wrong, it's fantastic. But as the never-ending hophead here, I always crave more. You got those big hops in there, just give a little more. Just let a little more extract into the boil before you pull it. Nonetheless, I only docked 1 point. I give it a 9. Moving on to the body, completely different compared to the Tocobaga. This had a really substantive body. It was quite robust, quite big, and felt thus in the mouth. I didn't dock any points. I gave it a 10 out of 10. It was fantastic. Mouthfeel on this one. Very much a classic IPA mouthfeel on this. It did get pretty creamy as it rolled around the palate. It wasn't quite as close to being the top tier status on the creamy side, but on the standard IPA mouthfeel and the nice viscosity, it was very, very close to upper echelon. I only docked 1 point. I gave it a 9. Finish on this beer. Very enjoyable finish. Pretty much a similar story in terms of length compared to the Tocobaga. It was very nice. This one was much more hop present and hop forward and bitter dominant. But given how bitter present and hop forward it was in terms of flavor, I was a little surprised that the finish didn't linger around any longer than it did. It was nice. It was certainly above average, but not top tier. It gets an 8 out of 10 there. Hen retention, just as with the first, it was lush and thick and creamy. It gets a 10 out of 10. Appearance on this one. Appearance was certainly within the scope of a standard IPA. I thought maybe this one's just a little bit on the darker side, but not by much. I docked 1 point. I gave it a 9. Balance on this. Very, very well balanced beer. This is a perfect case example of how to balance malts and hops in an IPA. Even though I always crave more bitters, you cannot say that the malt overshadowed the hop by any stretch of the imagination. This was hop-centric, and the hops were the star of the show. That's what I love in an IPA. That's what they're all about. It gets a 10 out of 10. Feeling in the intangible, I love this beer. I've had it many, many, many times. First time I've ever sat down and taken a really critical eye and broken down into its components. But it's a slam dunk of a beer for me. I love it. It's one I can usually get on tap at restaurants around here, even if they don't carry a big craft selection. This is one you can usually get, and it's always great. 10 out of 10 subjectively for me. Finally, as an example of the style, while I did nitpick a little and dock a few points for a few categories, I think overall this is a wonderful example of how to do an IPA properly. Don't let the malts get in the way of the hop. Let the hop be the star of the show. You can do dry hopping to extract more interesting aromas and different flavors into the end result, but make sure that you boil them in there long enough to extract the alpha acids out and in the finished product. So you get tons of hop potency and pungency and plenty of bitters to ride through on the back end and mix with those beautiful hop flavors and aromas that you get. This is a home run of an IPA. It's a great example. I gave it a 10 out of 10. That brings the total score on the Alai IPA to 93 out of 100. So all totaled a 20-point spread here. Now, no question in my mind, I do believe this is the superior IPA offering, though slightly different subgenre, but they're both great beers in their own right. If you like a little less intense IPA, a little less hop forward presence, a little less bitters, I would suggest the Tocobaga. If you're a hophead, I think you would very much enjoy the Alai. It is certainly hop forward. Folks, that's today's review. As always, I do sincerely appreciate you tuning in today. Please don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and if you want to keep in the loop when our videos go live to YouTube, you can click the notification bell icon. It is right next to the subscribe button. Till next time, keep it beer, keep it craft. We'll see you on the next one. Cheers.